Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video provides a historical analysis of the social, cultural, and legal evolution of divorce in the United States, and is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented does not constitute legal, psychological, or professional advice. Historical case studies and trends discussed should not be used as a substitute for modern legal counsel or professional therapy. Viewers are encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals regarding contemporary domestic or legal matters. Imagine a world where your very existence is legally erased because you dared to leave a toxic marriage. In 1850s America, a woman who sought a divorce didn't just lose a husband. She often lost her children, her property, her reputation, and her right to ever speak in polite society again. She became a social ghost, a femme soul, in a world that only valued the femme covert. We like to think of the United States as the land of the free, but for centuries, the American home was a gilded cage where the door was bolted shut by the weight of religious dogma and rigid social hierarchies. Today we see divorce as a common, albeit difficult, personal choice. But to understand how we got here, we have to look back at an era where a broken marriage was seen not as a personal tragedy, but as a direct threat to the stability of the American Republic itself. If you have ever wondered why certain stigmas around single parenthood or failed marriages still linger in our subconscious today, the answers are buried in the harsh courtrooms and judgmental parlors of the 18th and 19th centuries. By the end of this deep dive, you will understand the hidden architecture of the American family and the radical, often dangerous, lengths our ancestors went to just to find a second chance at happiness. The story of divorce in America is not a straight line of progress. It is a battlefield. To understand the gravity of the social stigma, we must first dismantle the myth that traditional marriage was always a romantic endeavor. For the vast majority of early American history, marriage was a civil and economic contract. In the eyes of the law, particularly under the British common law system of coverture that dominated the colonies, a woman's legal identity was submerged into that of her husband upon marriage. She could not own property, sign contracts, or keep her own wages. Therefore, the idea of breaking this contract was seen as a form of social anarchy. In the early colonial period, particularly in the Puritan settlements of New England, marriage was viewed as a pillar of the community. While the Puritans actually allowed for divorce more readily than the Anglican South, viewing marriage as a civil contract rather than a Catholic sacrament, the grounds were incredibly narrow. You could not simply leave because you were unhappy or incompatible. You had to prove a total breach of contract, such as desertion, bigamy, or extreme physical cruelty. Even then, the social cost was astronomical. A divorced person was often viewed with deep suspicion, suspected of harboring a disorderly spirit. The community believed that if a person could not maintain order within their own household, they were a risk to the order of the town. As we moved into the Revolutionary era, the rhetoric of independence and liberty began to seep from the political sphere into the domestic one. Thomas Jefferson and other founding figures flirted with the idea that if a people had the right to dissolve their political bonds with a tyrannical king, perhaps a spouse should have the right to dissolve a bond with a tyrannical partner. However, this remained largely theoretical. In practice, the legal hurdles were designed to be insurmountable for the average person. In many states, a divorce could only be granted by a literal act of the state legislature. This meant you had to hire a lawyer, gather witnesses, and have your private shames read aloud and debated by politicians in the state capitol. It was a public shaming ritual disguised as a legal process. Consider the case of a woman in the 1830s. If she sought a divorce on the grounds of adultery, she had to provide clear and convincing evidence. In an era without digital footprints or private investigators, this often meant dragging neighbors into court to testify about the sounds they heard through thin walls, or the sightings of a husband entering a brothel. The level of public exposure was so intense that many chose to endure physical abuse or abandonment, rather than face the scarlet letter of a public trial. This created a massive data gap in our historical understanding. For every one divorce recorded in the 19th century, historians estimate there were dozens of informal divorces, where husbands simply walked away, leaving their wives in a legal limbo known as civil widowhood. These women could not remarry, yet they had no husband to provide for them. The stigma was further reinforced by the cult of domesticity that rose to prominence in the mid-1800s. This cultural movement placed women on a pedestal as the moral guardians of the home. The home was meant to be a haven in a heartless world. If a marriage failed, the blame was almost universally placed on the woman. If she were a better wife, a more submissive partner, or a more pious mother, surely her husband wouldn't stray or drink. To be a divorcee was to admit that you had failed in your primary biological and social mission. It wasn't just a legal status, it was a character flaw. This is why we see the emergence of the divorce colony phenomenon in the late 19th century. Wealthy Americans who could afford the travel would flock to states like South Dakota or later, Nevada, where residency requirements were shorter and the grounds for divorce were slightly more liberal. These locations became the original sin cities, places where you went to wash off the stain of a failed marriage before returning to the East Coast under the guise of being a widow or widower. The data from this era shows a fascinating trend. As the 19th century closed, divorce rates did begin to climb, but the social backlash grew in equal measure. The great divorce reform movements of the late 1800s weren't actually trying to make divorce easier. They were trying to make it harder. Religious leaders and conservative politicians were terrified that the American family was disintegrating. They pointed to the rising divorce rates as a sign of national decay, linking it to everything from the rise of industrialization to the burgeoning women's suffrage movement. This created a paradoxical environment. While more people were seeking exits from unhappy unions, the social price of doing so was being hiked up through sermons, sensationalist newspaper headlines, and restrictive new laws. In this masterclass, we are going to peel back these layers of history to see how these early American attitudes shaped the modern landscape of the U.S. We will examine how the fault-based system, where one person had to be proven guilty of a crime to end a marriage, created a culture of litigation and animosity that defines many family court battles to this day. We will look at the racial and class-based disparities in how divorce was policed, where the luxury of a legal divorce was often reserved for the white elite, while marginalized communities were forced into informal arrangements that left them vulnerable to the law. This is not just a look at the past. It is a mirror to our present, showing us why we still carry the echoes of Victorian shame in our modern conversations about family, failure, and the pursuit of individual liberty. To truly grasp the magnitude of the social stigma in historical America, we have to look at the mechanics of the fault-based legal system. In 2026, we often take for granted the concept of no-fault divorce, where a couple can simply agree that the relationship has run its course. But for most of American history, the law required a villain. To obtain a divorce, you had to prove in a court of law that your spouse had committed a specific, grievous sin. These grounds were generally limited to adultery, desertion, or extreme physical cruelty. This legal requirement created a social theater of the highest stakes. If you could not prove your spouse was a monster, you remained legally bound to them forever. Imagine a woman named Mary in 1870s Ohio. Mary's husband is not physically abusive, but he is a chronic gambler who has spent their savings and emotionally abandoned the family. In the eyes of the law, Mary has no grounds for divorce. If she leaves him, she is the deserter. She loses access to her children because, under the prevailing legal doctrine of the time, the father had near absolute rights to the custody of offspring as they were considered his legal dependents and heirs. Mary is trapped not just by her marriage certificate, but by a legal framework that criminalizes her desire for a peaceful life. This is where the social stigma was weaponized. The law was designed to discourage divorce by making the process so humiliating and the consequences so dire that only the most desperate would pursue it. The requirement of proving fault led to a bizarre and often dark historical trend: the staged adultery. Because the legal bars were so high, couples who both desperately wanted to end their marriage would often conspire to manufacture evidence of a crime. A husband might hire a woman to be found in a hotel room with him by a prearranged witness. This perjury was an open secret in the American legal system for decades. However, the cost of this staged theater was the permanent destruction of one's reputation. Even if the adultery was a lie designed to secure a legal exit, the community treated the guilty party as a social pariah. In a small town in the 1880s, being labeled an adulterer in public court records was a professional and social death sentence. You would be expelled from your church, lose your business associates, and find yourself ignored on the street. The data from the late 19th century shows that as the Industrial Revolution pulled men away from farms and into cities, the instances of desertion skyrocketed. This became known as the poor man's divorce. Because the legal process was so expensive and stigmatized, many men simply disappeared to start new lives in the Western territories. This left thousands of women in a state of social and economic purgatory. These women were not quite widows and not quite wives. They were often referred to in census data as heads of household, but they lived under a cloud of suspicion. Neighbors would whisper, "What did she do to drive him away?" The stigma was a two-edged sword. If you stayed in a broken home, you were a martyr. But if you were abandoned, you were a failure. Let us look at a specific case study from the 1890s involving a high society couple in New York. The divorce of Alva and William Kissam Vanderbilt was a national scandal that perfectly illustrates the intersection of wealth, power, and stigma. Alva Vanderbilt did something nearly unthinkable for her class. She sued for divorce on the grounds of her husband's blatant adultery. While the evidence was overwhelming, the social elite were horrified, not by William's infidelity, which was common, but by Alva's insistence on a public legal filing. The stigma was so potent that even one of the wealthiest women in the world was briefly shunned by the 400, the elite social circle of New York. This case highlighted a critical historical reality. The stigma of divorce was often more about the breach of public decorum than the actual end of the love. The crime was making the private failure public. As we moved into the early 20th century, the rise of the divorce mills began to shift the narrative. Places like Reno, Nevada, realized there was a massive market for people who wanted to bypass the restrictive laws of their home states. By 1900, the residency requirement in Nevada was only 6 months. This gave birth to the divorce ranch, where wealthy individuals would stay for half a year to gain residency and secure a quick decree. This created a fascinating class divide in the social stigma. If you were wealthy enough to take a 6-month vacation in Reno, your divorce was seen as a sophisticated, if scandalous, eccentricity. But if you were a working-class woman in a tenement house seeking a divorce from an abusive husband, you were viewed as a threat to the moral fabric of the immigrant community. Step by step, the opposition to divorce became a central platform for religious organizations. In the early 1900s, the Interchurch Conference on Marriage and Divorce was formed specifically to lobby for a federal anti-divorce amendment to the U.S. Constitution. They argued that easy divorce would lead to the total collapse of the American government. They used pseudoscientific data to claim that children of divorced parents would inevitably become criminals or suffer from mental instability. This rhetoric was incredibly effective. It created a deep-seated fear in the American public that a single divorce was the first domino in the fall of civilization. This fear led to the implementation of collusion laws. Judges were instructed to deny a divorce if they suspected the husband and wife were actually agreeing to it. The court wanted to see a fight. They wanted to see bitterness. If a couple appeared too friendly in the courtroom, the judge would dismiss the case, forcing them to remain married. This effectively institutionalized marital conflict. The state was telling its citizens that if you want to be free, you must first prove that you hate each other. This legacy of state-mandated hostility is a primary reason why divorce remains one of the most litigious and aggressive areas of law today. We are still operating on the psychological remains of a system that demanded a victim and a villain. But what happened when the law couldn't stop the tide? As the 1920s roared in, the new woman emerged, economically independent, shorter skirts, and a refusal to stay in dead marriages. The conflict between this new era of personal expression and the old guard of Victorian morality reached a boiling point. The stigma didn't disappear. It morphed. It moved from the courtroom into the world of psychology and medicine. Divorced people were no longer just sinners. They were now diagnosed as maladjusted or neurotic. The shift from religious sin to psychological pathology marked a new chapter in the American stigma. It was no longer just about your soul, it was about your sanity. But as more and more Americans began to seek this sanity, through the exits of the Reno ranches and the backroom deals of city courts, a secret underground industry began to form. An industry that relied on private eyes, hidden cameras, and professional homewreckers hired to ensure a fault could be proven. This dark underbelly of the American legal system would eventually lead to a breaking point that no judge or politician could ignore. If you think the struggle for a legal exit was intense, wait until you see the physical dangers people faced when they couldn't get out. In the next part, we dive into the silent migration of the 1930s, the thousands of Americans who chose to live as outlaws rather than stay in their marriages. We will look at the rise of migratory divorce and the secret societies that helped people disappear and forge new identities just to escape a wedding ring. The lengths people went to will shock you, and it all leads back to one question. Why was the state so afraid of a single person being free? The reason the state was so terrified of a single person being free was rooted in the foundational belief that the family was the smallest unit of government. In the early 20th century, politicians and sociologists argued that if the domestic unit crumbled, the national unit would follow. This fear peaked during the Great Depression of the 1930s. While we often view the Depression through the lens of breadlines and dust bowls, it was also the era of the Great Domestic Fracture. Economic collapse didn't just break banks, it broke marriages. But because the legal system remained a rigid fortress of Victorian morality, thousands of Americans were forced into what historians now call the silent migration. Imagine a man named Robert in 1934 Chicago. Robert has lost his job at the rail yard. He can no longer provide for his wife and 3 children. The psychological weight of this failure, coupled with a deteriorating relationship, leads to a breaking point. However, in Illinois in 1934, Robert cannot simply get a divorce because he is unhappy or poor. He would need to prove adultery or extreme cruelty, involving a costly legal battle he cannot afford. So one Tuesday morning, Robert tells his family he is going to look for work. He walks to the bus station, buys a one-way ticket to California, and simply ceases to exist as Robert the husband. He changes his last name, creates a new backstory, and starts over. Robert has become an outlaw of the heart. This wasn't an isolated incident. The 1930s saw a massive spike in desertion cases, which social workers at the time labeled as the poor man's divorce. Case studies from urban centers like New York and Philadelphia show that desertion was the primary method of marital dissolution for the working class. Because the social stigma of being a divorcee was so crushing, and the legal fees were equivalent to several months' wages, disappearing was the most logical economic move. This created a massive social crisis. By 1940, it was estimated that millions of American women were living as de facto single mothers, unable to remarry because they were still legally tied to men who had vanished years ago. The state's response to this was not empathy, but increased surveillance. This is when we see the rise of the domestic relations court and the aggressive use of skip tracing. Authorities would track down these runaway husbands not to save the marriage, but to force them to pay support so the state wouldn't have to. The stigma shifted from being a sinner to being a drain on the public purse. If you were a divorced or deserted woman seeking government aid, you were subjected to midnight raids, where social workers would burst into your home to see if a man was staying there. If a man was found, your benefits were cut. The state was essentially acting as a moral police force, ensuring that no woman could enjoy the freedom of being single if she was also receiving public assistance. While the poor were disappearing into the shadows, the middle class began exploring the world of migratory divorce. This was a sophisticated, multi-step process that required careful planning and a bit of legal gymnastics. The most famous destination was Reno, Nevada, but there were others like Hot Springs, Arkansas, or even certain jurisdictions in Mexico. To understand the step-by-step nature of this, imagine a schoolteacher from Massachusetts in 1938. To get a divorce in her home state, she would have to prove a crime. Instead, she saves her money for a year, tells her neighbor she is visiting an ill relative, and travels to Reno. The first step was establishing residency. In Nevada, this meant staying within the state lines for exactly 6 weeks. This gave birth to a bizarre microeconomy of dude ranches and boarding houses specifically designed for the 6-week resident. You couldn't just sit in a hotel. You had to engage with the community to prove you intended to stay. You would get a local library card, open a small bank account, and perhaps take a temporary job. The day your 6 weeks were up, you would appear before a judge who asked a series of scripted questions. The grounds were almost always mental cruelty, a vague term that could mean anything from your spouse being grumpy to them not liking your cooking. Within 10 minutes, the decree was signed. However, the stigma followed you home. When the schoolteacher returned to Massachusetts, she faced a new legal hurdle: the question of jurisdiction. Her husband's lawyer could argue that the Nevada divorce was a sham because she never truly intended to live there. This led to high-stakes Supreme Court cases, such as Williams versus North Carolina, which debated whether one state had to respect the quickie divorces of another. For the American public, this created an atmosphere of legal instability. You could be divorced in Nevada but still married, and therefore a bigamist if you remarried in North Carolina. The social cost of this migratory path was a specialized form of gossip. People would say she went to Reno, a phrase that became shorthand for someone who was flighty, morally questionable, or too modern for their own good. The Reno divorcee became a trope in Hollywood films and literature, portrayed as a wealthy, bored woman who threw her wedding ring into the Truckee River. This stereotype masked the reality that most people going to Reno were doing so out of a desperate need for safety or a basic desire for a life free from conflict. By the time the United States entered World War II, the landscape of divorce underwent another seismic shift. The war brought about thousands of hasty marriages, as young soldiers wed their sweethearts before shipping out. It also brought women into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. For the first time, millions of American women had their own paychecks and a sense of agency outside the home. When the men returned in 1945, the clash was inevitable. The year 1946 saw the highest divorce rate in American history up to that point. The social stigma had to compete with the sheer volume of cases that the system wasn't prepared to handle. Data from the 1940s indicates that nearly 1 in 4 marriages ended in divorce immediately following the war. This was a statistical shock to the American system. The response from the media and the church was a full-scale moral panic. They called it the divorce crisis, and the rhetoric was used to push women out of the factories and back into the kitchen. The message was clear: your independence is destroying the nation. This era introduced the concept of the broken home as a psychological term, suggesting that any child raised outside a two-parent, traditional household was effectively damaged goods. This psychological stigma was perhaps the most enduring of all. It moved the shame from the act of divorce to the impact on the next generation. It created a culture of staying together for the kids, a mantra that kept millions of Americans in high conflict, even abusive environments for decades. The state, the church, and the medical establishment were now in total alignment. A bad marriage was a personal cross to bear, and seeking an exit was an act of ultimate selfishness. But as we move into the 1950s, the era of the white picket fence, a secret was brewing behind those manicured lawns. While the public face of America was one of domestic bliss, the private reality was a booming market for illegal and predatory divorce services. We are about to enter the era of the professional correspondent, and the rise of private detective agencies that turned marital misery into a lucrative corporate enterprise. If you think the legal hurdles were bad, wait until you see the businesses that were built to help people jump over them for a price. The next part of our deep dive explores the dark economy of 1950s divorce and the secret staged scandals that were used to trick the American courts. The 1950s in America are often remembered as a decade of pristine conformity, but beneath the surface of the suburban dream, the legal system was forcing citizens into a dark and surreal theater of deception. Because the social stigma of divorce had been codified into rigid fault-based laws, couples who wanted to separate were faced with an impossible choice: stay in a dead union or commit a felony to get out. In states like New York, the only legal ground for divorce was adultery. This led to the rise of one of the most bizarre and unethical industries in American history: the professional correspondent. Imagine a man named David in 1954 New York. David and his wife have simply grown apart. There is no abuse, no cheating, and no hatred. They are just two people who realize their marriage was a mistake. However, the law does not recognize their mutual desire for a new start. To get a divorce, David must be proven an adulterer. So David hires a specialized private investigation firm. For a hefty fee, the firm provides a woman, a professional correspondent, whose job is to be caught in a compromising position with David. The step-by-step mechanics of this staged scandal were chillingly clinical. First, David and the hired woman would go to a hotel and check into a room. They would not engage in any actual intimacy. Instead, they might sit on opposite ends of the bed reading newspapers or playing cards. At a prearranged time, David would call his own lawyer or a private detective. These men would then burst into the room, often accompanied by a photographer. They would take a flashbulb photo of David in his shirt sleeves and the woman in her slip. This photo, completely staged and fraudulent, would then be presented in a court of law as irrefutable evidence of a moral failing. The judge, the lawyers, and the detectives all knew the scene was a fake, but as long as the paperwork was in order, the state would grant the divorce. This created a massive ethical rot in the American legal system. Historical trends show that by the mid-1950s, thousands of these staged divorces were being processed annually. The social stigma was so powerful that the state preferred a perjured, fraudulent system over the simple admission that a marriage could end by mutual consent. For David, the price of freedom was a permanent public record naming him as a philanderer. In the tight-knit social circles of 1954, this record could prevent him from getting a promotion, being accepted into a country club, or even renting an apartment. The state was essentially forcing its citizens to choose between legal entrapment and social suicide. The data from this era reflects a fascinating cultural schizophrenia. While the media was saturated with images of the perfect nuclear family, the divorce rate remained surprisingly steady, hovering around 2.2 per 1,000 people. This suggests that the stigma didn't stop people from divorcing. It just made the process more expensive, more traumatic and more dishonest. This gave rise to the private investigator as a central figure in American domestic life. These investigators were not just looking for real cheaters, they were architects of manufactured shame. They were paid to find or create the fault required by the state. But what about those who couldn't afford a hotel room, a hired correspondent, and a high-priced lawyer? This is where the class-based nature of the stigma became most apparent. For the working class in the 1950s, the only realistic option was often abandonment or the poor man's divorce we discussed earlier. However, the 1950s introduced a new level of state surveillance. The Social Security Act and the rise of the modern welfare state meant that the government had a vested interest in keeping men in the home. If a man left his family, he could be tracked across state lines through his Social Security number. The stigma of being a deadbeat was born in this era, not just as a moral judgment, but as a legal category that allowed the state to garnish wages and pressure men back into unhappy homes. Consider a case study from a 1957 sociological report on an anonymous suburban development. A woman named Susan sought a divorce from her husband because of his chronic alcoholism. Even though she had fault on her side, her neighbors stopped speaking to her. In the 1950s, a divorced woman was seen as a contagion. Parents didn't want their children playing with Susan's children, fearing that the instability of her home would rub off on them. Susan was removed from the PDA and lost her job as a secretary because her employer felt a divorced woman was too distracted to be reliable. This wasn't just individual prejudice. It was a collective effort to protect the myth of the perfect American neighborhood. This atmosphere created a pressure cooker. By the late 1950s, psychologists began noticing a trend they called the problem that has no name, popularized later by Betty Friedan. It was a sense of deep dissatisfaction and isolation among suburban housewives who felt trapped in their roles, but were too terrified of the social stigma to leave. The medical community's response was often to prescribe mother's little helper, tranquilizers like Miltown and later Valium. Instead of fixing the laws that made divorce impossible, the society chose to sedate the people who were unhappy in their marriages. This is a crucial, often overlooked part of the stigma. It wasn't just about what happened after you divorced, it was about the psychological warfare used to keep you from even considering it. As we approached the 1960s, the tension became unsustainable. The civil rights movement and the early stirrings of the second-wave feminist movement began to question all of America's traditional hierarchies. People began to ask, if the state can't tell me where to sit on a bus, why can the state tell me I must stay married to someone I no longer love? The legal community was also reaching a breaking point. Judges were tired of presiding over the theatrical adultery cases and the obvious perjury that made a mockery of the bench. The stage was being set for a radical legal revolution that would change the American family forever. The transition from the 1950s to the 1960s was not a gentle one. It involved a total dismantling of the idea that the state had a right to police private morality. However, as the legal barriers began to fall, the social stigma didn't just vanish. It evolved into something even more complex. We are about to witness the birth of the no-fault era, a change that many thought would solve everything, but instead ignited a massive cultural war that we are still fighting today. In the next part, we go inside the room with Governor Ronald Reagan in 1969, as he signs the first no-fault divorce law in the country, an act he would later call one of his greatest political regrets. We will explore how this one signature unleashed a tidal wave of changes that no one saw coming, and how the stigma of the failure shifted from the parents to the children, creating the divorce generation that would redefine the American psyche in the 70s and 80s. The floodgates were about to open, and the water was much deeper than anyone expected. The year is 1969. In California, Governor Ronald Reagan sits at his desk, pen in hand, prepared to sign the Family Law Act. At the time, it was hailed as a sensible modern reform. By introducing no-fault divorce, California would become the first state to allow a marriage to be dissolved simply because of irreconcilable differences. No more staged hotel room photos, no more professional correspondence, and no more requirement to prove a crime. Reagan, himself a divorcee who had navigated the messy end of his marriage to Jane Wyman, believed this would reduce the animosity in the courtroom. However, this legislative stroke of the pen did something far more profound. It effectively ended the state's role as the moral arbiter of the American heart. What followed was a statistical explosion that shook the foundations of the country. Between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rate in the United States more than doubled. It wasn't that people suddenly started hating each other more. It was that the legal dam had finally burst. But as the legal barriers fell, the social stigma didn't disappear. It mutated into a weapon of generational guilt. The 1970s ushered in the era of the broken home as a national obsession. If the 1950s stigma was about the sin of the individual, the 1970s stigma was about the trauma of the child. Imagine a 10-year-old boy named Michael in 1975 suburban Virginia. His parents are among the thousands taking advantage of the new, easier legal pathways to separation. Michael becomes the only kid in his third-grade class with 2 houses. In 1975, this is not a common lifestyle. It is a mark of deviance. The school counselor views Michael as a ticking time bomb of psychological issues. His teachers look for signs of delinquency in every missed homework assignment. There was a prevailing cultural theory that a child from a divorced home was fundamentally incomplete, a half-person who would never truly understand how to function in a stable society. This was the birth of the divorce generation stigma, the idea that the parents' quest for self-actualization was a form of child sacrifice. The data from this period is staggering. Case studies conducted by sociologists in the mid-70s began to track the long-term potential outcomes for children of divorce. Books like The Divorce Experience and Surviving the Breakup became bestsellers, fueling a national anxiety. The stigma shifted from the courtroom to the therapist's couch. Divorced mothers, in particular, were scrutinized under a microscope. The working-class single mom became the scapegoat for a rising crime rate and a perceived decline in American values. The government and the media created a narrative that linked the disappearance of the traditional father figure directly to the erosion of the social contract. This led to the rise of a new type of historical trend, the latchkey kid. With more women entering the workforce post-divorce and fewer social safety nets in place, millions of American children were coming home to empty houses. The stigma attached to these families was intense. Neighbors would look at a house where the lights weren't on at 4 p.m. and see a failure of the American dream. The psychological community labeled these children as paternal deprived, suggesting that without a man in the house to provide discipline, a generation of boys would grow up without a moral compass. Step by step, the 1970s also saw the legal system struggle to keep up with the economic realities of this new freedom. No-fault divorce had an unintended and devastating financial consequence for women. Under the old fault-based system, a wife who was innocent of any wrongdoing had significant leverage to demand high alimony as the price for her husband's freedom. But under no fault, that leverage vanished. This led to what researchers called the feminization of poverty. In the decade following the California law, the standard of living for divorced women and their children plummeted by an average of 73%, while the standard of living for divorced men rose by 42%. The social stigma now had a tangible economic edge. Being divorced often meant being poor. Imagine a woman named Linda in 1978. She had been a homemaker for 15 years, supporting her husband's career and raising 3 children. When her husband decides to exercise his right to a no-fault divorce, Linda finds herself in a world that has no place for her. She has no recent job experience, no credit score in her own name, and a legal system that now views her as an equal partner who should be able to support herself immediately. The social stigma she faces is twofold. She is pitted as a victim of the new laws and simultaneously judged for her inability to lean in to the burgeoning feminist ideal of the career woman. She is caught between 2 eras and the safety net has been cut. As the 1980s dawned, the stigma took on a political dimension. This was the era of the moral majority and the rise of the religious right. Figures like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson used the rising divorce rates as a rallying cry to return to traditional family values. They argued that the 1969 California law was the beginning of the end for American exceptionalism. Divorce was no longer just a personal or psychological issue. It was a political battleground. This period saw the introduction of covenant marriage in some states, a type of marriage that required premarital counseling and made it much harder to get a divorce, effectively trying to turn back the clock to the pre-1960s era. The tension of the 1980s was defined by the superwoman myth versus the family-first reality. Women were told they could have it all, but if their marriage failed, it was seen as proof that they couldn't. The media focused heavily on the career woman, whose ambition supposedly drove her husband away, reviving the 19th century stigma that a woman's primary duty was the emotional maintenance of her husband. This was reflected in Hollywood films of the time, where divorced characters were often portrayed as either hyper-aggressive and lonely or tragically broken. But while the politicians and preachers yelled, the reality on the ground was changing. Divorce was becoming so common that the stigma began to lose its sharpness through sheer frequency. By 1985, half of all marriages were ending in divorce. It is hard to maintain a pariah status for 50% of the population. However, this didn't mean the shame was gone. It just went underground. It turned into a silent stigma, where people would offer condolences for a divorce in the same tone they would for a terminal illness. It was a tragedy to be managed, not a life event to be celebrated or even neutrally accepted. We are now entering the most complex phase of this historical journey. The 1990s and early 2000s would bring the rise of conscious uncoupling and the professionalization of the divorce industry. But it would also see a massive backlash in the form of the father's rights movement and new psychological theories about the resilient child. The battle lines were shifting from whether you could get a divorce to who owned the narrative of the family afterward. In the next part, we look at the high-stakes world of 1990s custody battles, where the stigma was used as a tactical weapon in the courtroom. We will see how parental alienation syndrome became the new adultery charge, and how the digital age began to record our domestic failures in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. The era of the public internet was about to make the scarlet letter digital and permanent. The transition into the 1990s and early 2000s marked a pivotal shift from the struggle for a legal exit to a brutal war over the narrative of the family. As divorce became statistically common, the social stigma didn't disappear. It simply became more tactical. In the courtrooms of the 1990s, the battle was no longer about whether you were allowed to leave, but rather who was the better parent. This gave rise to a new psychological weapon, parental alienation syndrome. This concept, while controversial in the medical community, became a staple of high-stakes custody battles. It was used to suggest that one parent was brainwashing the child against the other, effectively turning the child's trauma into a legal chess piece. The stigma was now focused on the alienating parent, usually the primary caregiver, who was accused of being emotionally unstable or vengeful. Imagine a woman named Sarah in 1994 suburban Illinois. Sarah has been the primary stay-at-home parent for a decade. When the marriage ends, she faces a legal system that is increasingly influenced by the father's rights movement, a group of men who felt that the no-fault revolution and the subsequent custody trends had unfairly marginalized them. Sarah's husband, advised by aggressive counsel, accuses her of alienating their two children because the children expressed a preference to stay with her. In a 1990s courtroom, this accusation could trigger a grueling psychological evaluation. Sarah is no longer just a divorcee. She is branded as a toxic mother by a court-appointed guardian ad litem. This illustrates how the historical trend of shaming shifted from the bedroom to the nursery. The failed wife of the 19th century was replaced by the obstructive mother of the late 20th century. The data from this period shows a significant rise in contested custody cases, which became the new revenue stream for the divorce industry. As the 1990s progressed, the average cost of a contested divorce in the United States skyrocketed. This created a profound class disparity in how stigma was experienced. Wealthy families could afford the private psychologists and mediators to smooth over the transition, creating a public image of a conscious uncoupling, long before that term became a Hollywood buzzword. Meanwhile, working-class families were left to navigate a public court system that was overwhelmed and often punitive. For a low-income family in 1998, a divorce could lead to a cycle of state intervention, as the broken home was still statistically linked in the eyes of social services to potential future delinquency. Step by step, the technology of the era began to change the permanence of this social shame. In the pre-digital age, a divorce decree was a paper record buried in a dusty basement at the county courthouse. Unless you were a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller, your personal failures stayed relatively local. But the late 1990s saw the birth of the public internet and the digitization of public records. Suddenly, anyone with a dial-up connection could search for your name and find your domestic history. This was the birth of the digital scarlet letter. Employers, neighbors, and potential new partners could now see the dirty laundry of a messy custody battle or a financial dispute with an ex-spouse. The privacy that once protected the middle class from the worst of the social stigma was evaporating. Consider the case study of a mid-level executive in 2002. He is applying for a senior position at a Fortune 500 company. The background check reveals not a criminal record, but a series of vitriolic filings from a divorce 5 years prior. Even though he did nothing illegal, the character of the man is questioned based on the accusations of an ex-spouse recorded in a permanent digital archive. The stigma had evolved from a moral judgment by a local priest to a risk assessment metric used by a human resources department. This is a crucial distinction in the American experience. The stigma became institutionalized and data-driven. As we moved into the early 2000s, the United States saw the rise of the silver divorce phenomenon. Historical trends indicate that while overall divorce rates began to stabilize or even slightly decline among younger generations, they were doubling for couples over the age of 50. This introduced a new social stigma, the failure of the long-term marriage. For a couple that had been married for 30 years to separate in 2005 was seen by their community as a profound betrayal of the American dream. The stigma here wasn't about instability or child-rearing, but about the perceived waste of a lifetime of social capital. Friends and family members often felt forced to choose sides, leading to the social isolation of the elderly divorcee. The economic implications for these silver divorcees were, and continue to be, catastrophic, particularly for women who had spent decades out of the workforce. The 2026 perspective on this looks back at the early 2000s as a period where the retirement crisis was exacerbated by the divorce rate. A single household is significantly more expensive to run than a shared one, and many Americans found that their Social Security and 401k plans were insufficient when split in half. The stigma of the impoverished divorcee returned with a vengeance, but this time it affected the suburban grandmother rather than the tenement mother of the 1890s. Furthermore, the early 2000s saw the cultural impact of the 1970s divorce generation coming to fruition. The children of the first no-fault wave were now adults getting married themselves. This created a culture of marital hypervigilance. Many young Americans were so terrified of replicating their parents' mistakes that they delayed marriage or opted for cohabitation instead. The stigma of divorce had become so internalized that the fear of it was actually changing the demographic makeup of the country. We see this in the data. The marriage rate began a steady decline as the risk of divorce was deemed too high by a generation that had seen the fallout firsthand. But just as the country seemed to be settling into a cautious post-divorce reality, the advent of social media in the mid-2000s added a new layer of complexity. If the internet made records permanent, social media made the performance of the divorce public. We entered the era of the divorce announcement on Facebook, a carefully curated post designed to manage the narrative and mitigate the social fallout. But for every curated post, there were a dozen impulsive late-night rants that turned private pain into public spectacle. The community was no longer just whispering over the backyard fence. They were liking, sharing, and commenting on the destruction of a family in real time. This leads us to a fundamental question about the American character. Why, after 250 years of increasing legal freedom, do we still feel the need to perform success or failure for the public eye? The stigma hasn't vanished. It has just moved onto our screens. We are now in a world where your domestic history is a brand, and a divorce is a rebranding event that requires a PR strategy. But beneath the digital surface, the old ghosts of Victorian morality and Puritan judgment are still very much alive, waiting to be triggered by the next viral scandal. We are about to enter the final chapters of this masterclass, where we look at the most modern frontiers of this struggle, from the rise of divorce parties as a form of counter-stigma to the legal battles over frozen embryos that are redefining what a family even is in the eyes of the law. The battle for the American home has moved from the courtroom to the laboratory, and the stakes have never been higher. In the next part, we explore the radical shift toward amicable divorces, and whether this is a genuine evolution or just a new way to hide the same old shame. We will look at how the 2010s saw a massive push to optimize the end of a marriage through high-tech apps and private mediation, and how this has created a new kind of social pressure, the pressure to have a perfect divorce. If you thought the 1950s demand for a perfect marriage was intense, wait until you see the modern demand for a flawless separation. The 2010s ushered in a new and complex layer of social expectation that historians are beginning to call the era of the optimized exit. As the shock of the 1970s divorce boom faded into the background of American life, a new cultural mandate emerged. The requirement that a divorce be high-minded, collaborative, and entirely devoid of public animosity. This was the birth of the good divorce, a concept that, while intended to reduce trauma, created a different kind of crushing stigma for those whose separations remained messy, painful, or financially ruinous. The cultural icon of this shift was the 2014 announcement by actress Gwyneth Paltrow regarding her conscious uncoupling. This wasn't just a celebrity headline. It was a manifesto for a new American standard. It suggested that a failed marriage was not a tragedy, but a successful graduation into a new phase of life. Imagine a woman named Chloe in 2016 Seattle, Chloe is going through a divorce that is anything but conscious. Her husband has been emotionally unavailable for years, and the discovery of his hidden debt has left their joint accounts depleted. Chloe feels rage, betrayal, and deep grief. However, her social circle, influenced by the burgeoning wellness culture of the mid-2010s, pressures her to be the bigger person. They recommend meditation retreats, co-parenting apps, and expensive private mediators who charge $500 an hour to facilitate a peaceful transition. When Chloe expresses her anger or her desire to fight for a fair settlement in court, she is met with a new form of shaming. She is told she is being toxic, that she is holding on to trauma, and that her inability to have a friendly brunch with her ex-husband is a failure of her personal growth. The stigma had moved from the act of leaving to the manner of leaving. If you weren't divorcing correctly, you were once again a social pariah. Step by step, the 2010s also saw the professionalization of the divorce industry through technology. Historical trends show a massive influx of venture capital into legal tech, designed to streamline the domestic dissolution process. Apps like Webvorce or Talking Parents were marketed as tools to bypass the barbaric litigation of the past. These tools promised a sanitized, data-driven path to freedom. While these innovations certainly helped some families avoid the vitriol of the 1990s, they also created a digital record of performance. Every message sent through a court-monitored app was archived. The state was no longer just policing your right to leave. It was now monitoring your tone, your punctuality, and your compliance with a preset digital schedule. The optimized divorce was a monitored divorce. The data from this decade indicates a significant rise in private mediation. By 2018, nearly 80% of divorces in some U.S. jurisdictions were settled out of court. On the surface, this looks like progress. However, deeper case studies suggest that this shift often favored the spouse with more financial literacy or psychological dominance. Without a judge to oversee the equity of the split, the amicable agreement often became a mask for a coerced surrender. The social stigma of being difficult or litigious was so strong that many individuals, particularly women who had been out of the workforce, agreed to settlements that left them economically vulnerable. The perfect divorce was often bought at the price of one partner's long-term security. Consider the case of a mid-career professional in 2019. He wants to ensure his divorce doesn't affect his personal brand on LinkedIn or his standing in his local tech community. He hires a divorce coach, a new profession that exploded in the late 2010s, to help him manage the optics of his separation. The coach advises him on how to phrase his social media announcements, how to coordinate unified birthday parties for his children, and how to maintain the appearance of a seamless transition. This is the commodification of the stigma. We had moved from a society that hid divorce to a society that curated it. The shame was no longer in the ending of the contract, but in the visibility of the seams. If the public could see the struggle, you had failed the modern test of emotional intelligence. This era also saw a radical reimagining of the broken home narrative. In the 2010s, sociologists began pushing the concept of bird nesting, where the children stay in the family home and the parents rotate in and out. This was presented as the ultimate child-centered solution. However, for many American families, this was financially impossible, requiring the maintenance of 3 separate residences. The stigma now had a heavy price tag. If you couldn't afford to bird nest or provide your children with 2 equal homes that mirrored each other in every detail, you were judged against an idealized standard of upper-middle-class stability. The divorce generation of the 70s was being replaced by the co-parenting generation, where the pressure to be a super ex was just as intense as the 1950s pressure to be a super wife. Furthermore, the 2010s brought a new frontier of legal and social conflict, the battle over genetic material. With the rise of IVF and egg freezing, divorcing couples began fighting over frozen embryos. These cases, such as the high-profile battle between Sofia Vergara and Nick Loeb, forced the American public to confront questions of personhood, bodily autonomy, and the very definition of family. The stigma in these cases was visceral. A woman who wanted to destroy embryos was branded a life ender by some, while a man who wanted to use them against her will was branded a coercive controller. These weren't just legal disputes, they were proxy wars for the nation's deepest moral divides. The courtroom was once again a theater of public judgment, but the props had changed from hotel room photos to petri dishes. As we reached 2020, the global pandemic added a final, chaotic twist to this historical journey. The lockdowns of the early 2020s forced unhappy couples into prolonged, inescapable proximity. This led to what some called the pandemic divorce surge, but the reality was more nuanced. While filings initially spiked, many were delayed by court closures, creating a massive backlog that persisted for years. The pandemic also stripped away the ability to perform the perfect divorce. You couldn't have the unified birthday party or the seamless transition when the world was shut down. The raw, unvarnished reality of domestic failure was back in the spotlight, and the optimized exit was suddenly a luxury that few could afford or maintain. From the 2026 perspective, we can see that the 2010s attempt to solve the stigma of divorce through wellness and technology was only partially successful. It replaced the old moral shame with a new psychological and aesthetic shame. We are still a nation obsessed with the integrity of the family unit, even as we redefine what that unit looks like. We have moved from the scarlet letter to the perfectly curated post, but the underlying anxiety remains the same, the fear that if our most intimate relationships fail, we have failed as citizens. But there is one final boundary that has yet to be fully explored. As we move into the final parts of this masterclass, we will look at the rise of post-human domesticity. In an era of AI companions, digital legacies, and the decentering of traditional marriage by Gen Z, is the stigma of divorce finally dying? Or is it being replaced by something even more radical? We are about to look at the most recent data from 2024 to 2026, where the very concept of marriage is being dismantled by a generation that views forever as a bug, not a feature. In the next part, we dive into the great unlinking of the 2020s. We will explore how the rise of solo living and situationships has turned divorce into a niche concern for a shrinking demographic. We will look at the divorce influencers of TikTok and how they are turning the most painful moments of their lives into viral content for profit. Is this the ultimate liberation from stigma? Or is it the final cynical stage of the commodification of the American heart? The answer lies in the data of the last 24 months. The data from the last 24 months suggests we have entered an era where the social stigma of divorce is being actively dismantled by a new generation of digital natives. Yet it is being replaced by a sophisticated, algorithm-driven form of public consumption. In 2026, the American landscape of domestic dissolution is no longer defined by the hushed tones of the 1950s or the clinical optimization of the 2010s. Instead, we are seeing the rise of the divorce influencer. On platforms like TikTok and Instagram, the most intimate and traditionally shameful moments of a marital breakdown, the packing of boxes, the first night in a new apartment, the tearful explanation to children, are now serialized content. For these creators, the stigma is not a weight to be carried, but a narrative engine to be harnessed. Imagine a creator named Jax in early 2026. Jax is 28 years old and has decided to end his 3-year marriage. Instead of retreating from his social feed, he launches a series titled My Divorce Era. Each step of the legal and emotional process is documented with high-definition cinematography and trending audio. He films the moment he signs the digital filing on his tablet. He does a room tour of his bachelor pad. He reviews the best apps for dividing shared assets. To his hundreds of thousands of followers, this isn't a failure. It is a relatable journey of self-discovery. However, this creates a new subtle pressure, the pressure to be a brand-compliant divorcee. If Jax's content becomes too dark, too messy, or too stagnant, he loses engagement. The community that once shamed the divorcee now demands that the divorcee be entertaining. Step by step, this commodification has led to the emergence of the divorce economy 2.0. Historical trends indicate that as traditional marriage rates continue to decline, reaching historic lows in 2025, the industry surrounding the end of marriage has had to pivot. We see the rise of divorce registries, where friends and family can buy a newly single person a blender, a set of sheets, or even contribute to a legal fund. This is a radical departure from the 19th century scarlet letter. It frames the divorce as a milestone similar to a wedding or a baby shower. While this reduces the immediate social isolation, it also turns a personal crisis into a consumerist event. The stigma is being bought out by the market. If you can afford the right products and the right branding, your divorce is a glow-up rather than a breakdown. The data from the 2020s also highlights a massive demographic shift, known as the Great Unlinking. Among Gen Z and younger millennials, the very concept of a lifelong legal contract is being questioned with unprecedented skepticism. Case studies of relationship patterns in 2026 show a preference for situationships or LAT, living apart together, arrangements. For these groups, divorce isn't a stigma because marriage was never the goal. The stigma has shifted toward the institution of marriage itself, which is increasingly viewed as an outdated, high-risk financial and emotional trap. In this cultural context, getting a divorce is seen as a logical course correction rather than a moral failure. It is the person who stays in a stagnant or mediocre marriage who is now often judged as lacking the courage to optimize their life. However, this liberation is not evenly distributed across the American public. Beneath the viral videos of 2026, the old legal and religious stigmas remain entrenched in specific geographic and socio-economic pockets. In many rural communities and within certain Orthodox religious groups, the divorcee is still a category of person to be avoided. A case study from a small town in East Texas in 2024 reveals that a woman seeking a divorce from her church-prominent husband was effectively barred from her local social circles and found her business boycotted. The digital world may be moving toward a post-stigma reality, but the physical world still operates on much older, more primitive social codes. This creates a psychological whiplash for many Americans who live their lives online in one reality and their physical lives in another. Furthermore, the rise of AI and digital legacies has introduced a surreal new layer to the social stigma of divorce. In 2026, we are seeing the first major legal battles over digital assets and AI replicas. Imagine a couple that shared a smart home system for a decade. The AI in that home has been trained on their collective preferences, their private jokes, and their joint history. When they divorce, who gets the memory of the home? If one spouse deletes the other from the system, it is seen as a form of digital erasure that carries a deep psychological sting. The stigma now involves being unpersoned by technology. We are also seeing the rise of deepfake technology being used in vitriolic divorce cases, where private videos are manipulated to create false fault for a public audience. The hotel room photos of 1954 have been replaced by the deepfake videos of 2026, making the truth of a divorce harder than ever to pin down. The economic reality of the mid-2020s also plays a crucial role in the modern stigma. With the cost of housing at an all-time high, many divorcing couples are forced into cohabitating divorce. They are legally separated but cannot afford to live in two different dwellings. They divide the house with tape, they schedule kitchen times, and they attempt to lead separate lives under one roof. The social stigma for these couples is intense. They are viewed as stuck or failed by a society that values mobility and clean breaks. The success of a divorce in 2026 is often measured by the ability to physically leave. If you are poor, you are denied the luxury of a socially acceptable divorce, forcing you to stay in a state of domestic purgatory that is visible to everyone you know. We must also consider the role of the state in this new era. While no-fault laws remain the standard, there has been a growing legislative movement in 2025 and 2026 to introduce cooling-off periods and mandatory mediation for couples with children. These laws are often framed as child protection measures, but critics argue they are a modern reimposition of the state's moral authority. They suggest that the individual's right to leave is once again being subordinated to a collective stability goal. This creates a new bureaucratic stigma, the stigma of the impulsive parent. If you want to leave quickly, the state assumes you are acting out of a character flaw, rather than a valid need for safety or happiness. As we look at the historical trajectory from 1850 to 2026, a clear pattern emerges. We have moved from a society that used the law to trap people, to a society that used psychology to shame them, to a society that uses the market to commodify them. Each era believes it has solved the problem of divorce, yet the stigma merely changes its clothes. In the final parts of this masterclass, we will synthesize these lessons to understand what the future of the American family actually looks like. Is it possible to have a society without domestic stigma? Or is the failed marriage an essential shadow that must exist to define the successful one? In the next part, we turn our focus to the Great Reconciliation of the late 2020s, a surprising trend where couples are increasingly choosing conscious remarriage to the same person. We will examine how the burnout of the optimized and branded life is leading some back to traditional structures, but with a radical modern twist. We will look at the rise of the beta marriage and the 5-year renewable contract, and how these innovations are finally putting the final nail in the coffin of the till death do us part stigma. The American home is being redesigned from the ground up, and the blueprint is nothing like what our ancestors imagined. The redesign of the American home in 2026 has reached a point of radical experimentation that effectively challenges the very definition of a failed marriage. We are currently witnessing the rise of the beta marriage, a concept that has transitioned from a niche Silicon Valley theory into a practical lifestyle choice for thousands of American couples. This model operates on the premise that a marriage should not be an indefinite sentence, but a renewable contract. Couples sign legal agreements with a 5-year or 10-year term. When the term expires, they must actively choose to renew the partnership or let it dissolve without the traditional legal warfare or social shame associated with a divorce. In this framework, the end of a marriage is not seen as a failure of character, but as the natural conclusion of a successful term. It is a fundamental shift in the historical trend of longevity, being the sole metric of marital success. Imagine a couple named Jordan and Taylor in 2026 Chicago. They are both in their early 30s and have just completed their first 5-year marital term. Under the beta marriage model, they spent the last 6 months of their contract in facilitated discussions about their growth, their changing goals, and their individual happiness. When the contract expired, they decided not to renew. Because this was the plan from the beginning, there was no shock, no scandal, and no community shaming. Jordan and Taylor held a transition ceremony, where they thanked each other for the 5 years of companionship and growth. To their friends and family, this wasn't a divorce, it was a graduation. This scenario highlights how the social stigma is being neutralized through the intentionality of the contract. The shame of "until death do us part" is replaced by the pride of "until the mission is complete." Step by step, this movement is being supported by a new class of legal professionals known as marital architects. These are not divorce lawyers. They are consultants who help couples design their renewable contracts with clear exit strategies built in from day one. They address asset division, co-parenting philosophies, and social media protocols before the first "I do" is even uttered. Data from 2025 indicates that couples using these renewable models report significantly lower levels of stress and a higher sense of personal agency. By removing the forever pressure, they actually find more room for authentic connection during the term of the contract. The state is beginning to take notice, with several progressive jurisdictions exploring legal frameworks that would officially recognize term-limited civil unions. However, as we dismantle the stigma of the end, a surprising countertrend has emerged: the Great Reconciliation. While many are opting for shorter, more flexible bonds, a significant segment of the population is returning to the idea of a lifelong commitment, but through the lens of conscious remarriage. This involves couples who divorced years ago, perhaps during the chaotic optimized exit era of the 2010s, realizing that the grass was not greener on the other side. But they aren't just getting back together. They are entering into marriage 2.0 with the same person. Historical trends show a 15% increase in remarriage to a former spouse between 2023 and 2026. This is the ultimate meta-stigma event. These couples have to navigate the social embarrassment of having publicly failed once, only to admit they want to try again. Consider the case study of a couple in Seattle who divorced in 2018 after a decade of marriage. They spent 5 years living separate lives, dating other people, and maturing independently. In 2024, they reconnected. When they decided to remarry in 2026, they faced a unique social challenge: how to explain this to a community that had already taken sides in their previous split. They had to perform a second act of social integration, proving that their first divorce wasn't a mistake, but a necessary sabbatical for their individual growth. This suggests that in 2026, the stigma is no longer about the divorce itself, but about the inconsistency of the human heart. We are a society that demands a clear, linear narrative, and a reconciliation breaks that line. The data also reveals a fascinating shift in how Gen Z views these failed experiments. For a generation raised on the instability of the 2000s and 2010s, the failed marriage is seen as a badge of experience. On professional networking sites, it is becoming more common to see domestic transitions listed as a form of personal development. The skills learned in a divorce, negotiation, emotional regulation, crisis management, and financial restructuring are being reframed as valuable life assets. We are moving toward a portfolio view of relationships. Just as a professional career is now a collection of different roles and companies, a personal life is seen as a collection of different significant unions. The stigma of the one-and-done marriage is being replaced by the stigma of the stagnant life. Yet, even in this era of radical acceptance, a new shadow is forming. As we destigmatize the exit, we are inadvertently stigmatizing the struggle. In a world where you can simply not renew a contract or consciously uncouple with an app, the couple that chooses to stay in the messy, painful and unoptimized trenches of a difficult marriage is often viewed with confusion or pity. There is a rising social pressure to be happy or independent above all else. If you are not flourishing, the modern stigma suggests you are simply not brave enough to leave. The 19th century shamed the leaver. The 21st century is beginning to shame the stayer. This is the final inversion of the American domestic ideal. Furthermore, we must look at the role of the divorce shadow economy in 2026. While the middle class is enjoying these new, flexible models, the working class is still trapped in a system that hasn't caught up. For a family living paycheck to paycheck, a term-limited contract is a luxury they cannot afford. They are still subject to the old fault-based echoes in state-funded legal aid and the prying eyes of social services. The stigma has become a class marker. A successful divorce is a sign of high status, while a messy divorce is a sign of social failure. We have essentially created two different Americas. One where the heart is a flexible, branded asset, and another where it remains a liability that can lead to total economic collapse. This class divide is exacerbated by the rise of AI-driven relationship maintenance bots. In 2026, many high-income earners use AI assistants that monitor their communication with their spouses, flagging potential conflicts before they escalate and suggesting connection exercises based on biometric data. When these marriages fail despite the technology, the stigma is amplified. It is seen as a failure of system management. The community wonders, you had all the data, all the tools, and all the help, how did you still let it break? This introduces a technocratic stigma that our ancestors in 1850 could never have imagined. It is no longer a sin against God. It is a bug in the code of the household. As we reach the conclusion of this historical deep dive, we have to ask ourselves, have we actually made progress, or have we just traded one set of chains for another? We have moved from the courtroom to the app, from the preacher to the influencer, and from the scarlet letter to the digital archive. We have fought for the right to leave for over 200 years, and now that we have it, we are finding that the freedom of 2026 comes with its own set of public performances and private anxieties. The final part of this masterclass will synthesize everything we have learned. We will look at the ultimate future of the American family and ask the most important question of all. What happens to the children of the beta marriage and the Great Reconciliation? We are about to look at the first set of data from children raised in these term-limited environments, and the results are not what anyone expected. We are standing on the edge of a new psychological frontier that will define the next 100 years of the American experiment. In the next part, the finale, we reveal the silent successor to the traditional family. We will explore how the concept of the tribe is replacing the couple as the primary unit of American stability, and how the social stigma of divorce is being swallowed by a new collective way of living. This is the end of the individual era, and the beginning of something much older and much more radical. We are going home, but not to the home our parents knew. To understand why we are moving toward a collective model of living in 2026, we have to recognize the ultimate failure of the individualistic divorce era. For nearly a century, the American legal and social system focused on the rights of the two individuals within a marriage to separate. While this provided essential liberty, it created a massive stability vacuum. The data from the early 2020s revealed a breaking point. Solo living was becoming economically and psychologically unsustainable for the majority of the U.S. population. This has given rise to the silent successor of the nuclear family, the intentional tribe. We are seeing a historical trend where divorced individuals are not looking for a new spouse, but for a new community. They are forming co-housing agreements, shared equity households, and multi-adult parenting units that effectively bypass the traditional binary of married or divorced. Imagine a woman named Maya in 2026 Austin, Texas. Maya has been divorced twice. In the 1950s, she would have been a social outcast. In the 1990s, she would have been a high-conflict litigation statistic. But in 2026, Maya lives in a repurposed suburban cul-de-sac with 4 other divorced adults and their collective children. They share a single mortgage, a commercial-grade kitchen, and a rotating childcare schedule. In this environment, Maya's divorce status is irrelevant. She is not a divorcee. She is a founding member of a micro-commune. The social stigma of her failed marriages has been swallowed by the success of her collective living. This is the radical redesign of the American home. A move away from the fragile two-person pillar toward a broader, more resilient foundation. Step by step, the legal system is beginning to adapt to this reality through the introduction of multi-party domestic agreements. These are complex legal structures that allow groups of non-romantic adults to share parental rights, property, and tax liabilities. Historical trends suggest that by the end of 2026, over 3% of U.S. households will operate under some form of intentional community contract. This is the final frontier in the destigmatization of divorce. When the end of a romantic partnership does not result in the total collapse of the household, the fault and the shame lose their power. If the tribe remains even when the couple dissolves, the trauma of the split is mitigated by the continuity of the community. The data concerning children raised in these multi-adult households is particularly revealing. Case studies from 2025 indicate that children in intentional tribes often exhibit higher levels of social adaptability and lower rates of separation anxiety, compared to children in high-conflict nuclear homes or isolated single-parent households. Because they have multiple stable adult figures in their lives, the departure of one parent from the romantic unit does not mean the departure of that parent from the home or the child's daily life. We are witnessing the birth of a generation that views family as a network rather than a hierarchy. For these children, the concept of a broken home is an archaic relic of a world they no longer recognize. However, the transition to this collective model is not without its own set of social pressures. In 2026, a new stigma is emerging: the stigma of the isolate. If you choose to live alone or insist on a traditional, isolated nuclear family model that fails, you are increasingly judged for your lack of social capital and your failure to build a support network. The American dream of the lonely house on the hill is being replaced by the dream of the thriving hub. This is a deep irony in the history of U.S. social stigma. The very independence that 20th century divorcees fought for is now being reframed as a risk factor. To be single and isolated in 2026 is seen as a failure of community building. Consider the economic implications of this shift. In 2026, the insurance industry and mortgage lenders are beginning to offer products specifically for intentional tribes. These products assess risk based on the collective stability of the group, rather than the individual credit scores of a couple. This means that a person's divorce history no longer prevents them from accessing favorable rates, as long as they are part of a stable collective. We are seeing the institutionalization of the tribe. This economic shift is the most potent destigmatizer in history. When your marital status no longer dictates your ability to own a home or secure your future, the scarlet letter finally runs out of ink. We must also look at the role of the legacy divorce. As the baby boomer generation continues to age, the 2020s have seen a surge in post-retirement divorces aimed at cleaning up the estate. These are not emotional splits but tactical ones, designed to protect assets and ensure that inheritances are not tied up in complex marital laws. These cases show that even at the end of life, the American public is using divorce as a tool of pragmatism rather than a statement of moral failure. The stigma of the old divorcee has been replaced by the image of the savvy estate planner. This is the ultimate secularization of the marriage contract. As we conclude this 10-part deep dive, we can see the full arc of the American domestic experience. In 1850, divorce was a rare, catastrophic event that resulted in total social erasure. In 1950, it was a shameful secret hidden behind staged photos and perjured testimony. In 1970, it was a liberating but traumatic explosion that redefined childhood. In 2010, it was a wellness-branded uncoupling. And today, in 2026, it is a routine logistical adjustment within a broader, more fluid definition of human connection. We have moved from a society of duty to a society of identity, and finally to a society of utility. The social stigma of divorce in historical America was never really about the marriage itself. It was about the fear of change. It was a tool used by the state, the church, and the community to enforce a specific type of order. But as the American public has proven time and again, the human desire for happiness and authenticity eventually outweighs the fear of judgment. We have dismantled the gilded cage, but in doing so, we have discovered that we still need walls, just different ones. The intentional tribes of 2026 are our attempt to build those walls without the locks. This documentary has traced the potential outcomes of 2 centuries of domestic rebellion. We have seen how historical trends in law, technology, and psychology have converged to create the modern U.S. family. But as every historian knows, the end of one era is simply the prologue to the next. As we look toward the 2030s, the question is no longer will you stay married? But who is in your tribe? The answer to that question will define the next chapter of the American story. If you have found value in this masterclass, You are now equipped to see the hidden architecture behind every broken home and every successful union you encounter. The history of divorce is the history of the American heart trying to find its way home. But the story doesn't end with the tribe. There is a burgeoning movement of neo-traditionalism gaining ground among Gen Alpha, a generation that has seen the fluidity of the 2020s and is now craving a return to absolute permanence. Are we about to see the return of the lifelong covenant? Or is the contractual era here to stay? That is a deep dive for another time. For now, look at the house next door not as a unit of two, but as a node in a much larger, more complex web of human survival. The stigma is dead. Long live the network.